Senator Kaine, you know a little bit about Latin America. Would you care to share with us?
Thank you. Well, I'm really happy to be here with the witnesses, and just a thought about the Monroe Doctrine. One of the things we need to be a little bit careful of is in Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine is viewed as the U.S. wasn't really interested in Latin America; it was interested in Europe, and it was a doctrine: we're going to keep Europe out, not you're important. It was we're going to keep Europe out, and sometimes I think that Latin American countries believe that U.S. pays attention when others are interested, like China or Russia, but we're not paying attention because we value the relationships. And so, and I think any new doctrine is one that certainly we ought to be worrying about this, but we also need to be communicating the message that we value the relationship, and that should be first. And we do need more attention. I'm worried about the USAID cuts. I'm worried about Secretary Hegseth gave a directive to departments in the Pentagon to develop a cut plan, and then he exempted certain parts of the Pentagon from the cut plan, but not Southcom. Southcom always complains about not having enough resources. We'll see what the cut plan actually is, but if Southcom's resources are degraded further, that's a problem. And then the other thing I'm concerned about is the administration has announced, not with respect to the Americas, but more generally, a desire to shrink the number of consular offices around the world. So if there begins to be less of a presence in Latin America or elsewhere, that could have a challenge. So I hope we can work on those. Let me tell you, from really loving this area and having lived there, 3 challenges that I see, and I may ask you to pick any of them and address them and give us some advice. Number one, in the Americas, I think China sometimes gets more credit than they really deserve for this reason. China will come with a pretty big checkbook, and a Chinese company is viewed as part of the Chinese government. So they got a big checkbook. The U.S. government comes with a small checkbook, but then U.S. businesses are all over Latin America with a big checkbook, but the U.S. government does not get credit for the U.S. investment. That's kind of happening, because of free markets, et cetera. So when you hear Latin American leaders say, well, China's got a lot on the table. What about you guys? What do you have on the table? They're giving us credit for the U.S. government check. They're not really considering the total investment. So I think one challenge we have is figuring out a way through financing tools and others to really help message that, hey, we are more present than China if you consider whole of society and measure that against whole of Chinese society, we're more present. We're not getting credit for the private sector investment. I'm really thrilled about this BlackRock investment that Senator Cornyn discussed. Second, here's another problem in the Americas. We pay attention to the trouble spots and not the successes. And of course, we ought to pay attention to the trouble spots. Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. But when you've got, Uruguay doing some things well, Panama doing some things well, Paraguay, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Chile, Colombia, military to military, very strong, even though we've got some challenges on the civilian side, we're more paying attention to the headaches and we're not paying attention to the success stories. And some of the successful nations are like, hey, we'd be better off being your adversary. You'd pay more attention to us. Our humanitarian aid, once nations get to sort of a middle income place, the tools of USAID, even if we turn on the funds, they don't get them. They can get a security deal, but not development assistance. China is not stopping development assistance to nations when they get to be middle income. They're like, we're glad to be there. So I think the way if we're worried about Latin American democracy and success, the best thing is to help the successful nations even be more successful, because then their next door neighbors will look at them and say, yeah, we want to be more like that. So us lecturing them about how to be successful is not going to be near as successful as seeing a successful neighbor next door. We ought to figure out ways to take the nations that are doing things right and give them more resources and attention. And then the third thing, and I blame myself for this, I'm very guilty of this. We talk about the Americas. We don't do enough in the Caribbean. And then we end up with all these Caribbean nations voting against us in the UN on all kinds of things. Because when we think about the Americas, I know I'm always thinking about Central America and South America, and I put that on myself. We need to broaden the aperture a little bit to maybe invest more in the Caribbean, and they're very hungry for us to put more attention in. So address either of those. How can we get more credit for what we do society-wide? How can we pay more attention to the successes than the headaches? And what should we be doing more in the Caribbean? If you could each pick one of those and give a quick answer.
I'll begin. Excellent points. Maybe I can touch on all 3. I think what you're really hinting at is what has to be included in the strategy that will be due in June is a public diplomacy component. to message the success cases while also combating democratic backsliding and so forth, but to put the message across of the points that you've hit on. And I very much agree about the Caribbean. And as I pointed out in my opening statement, the crisis in Haiti is the looming crisis that's going to challenge the United States that we're not paying enough attention to in the Western Hemisphere. If Haiti completely collapses as a country of 12 to 13 million people, where do you think they're headed? That creates a humanitarian catastrophe. The Dominican Republic, next door, another nation of 12 to 13 million people, will be on the verge of collapse. And sticking with the Dominican Republic, great success case. We should strengthen our strategic partnership with the Dominican Republic across all sectors. They're hungry for it. There's been a lot of progress made on that front with Secretary Rubio's recent trip. In fact, they're asking us and inviting us to help them develop their critical minerals, rare earth industry. This is a nation that's projected to have 5% GDP growth.
Might I have Ms.
Yeah,
Myers
yeah.
just say something really quick, Mr. Chair? Thank you. Please, Ms. Myers.
Apologies. No, I would love to, first of all, I agree wholeheartedly on all of these points. They're absolutely fundamental, you know, especially the conceptualization of the Monroe Doctrine and how that's problematic and how, you know, we have to ensure that our Latin America policy doesn't come across as a China policy or as a Russia policy or any other form of alignment with our adversaries. On the issue of, you know, China getting more credit than it deserves. This is, I mean, to me, largely a messaging issue, right? China comes to the table with big numbers. Many of those numbers are not met, right? It comes to the table with a lot of promises. A lot of those promises don't come to pass. I'm thinking about the lithium sector right now, where there have been promises to build factories to build lithium batteries all over Argentina and elsewhere. None of that's happened. None of that, there's no intention for that to happen, right? So making that clear, demonstrating that those promises indeed are unlikely to come to pass, I think is absolutely fundamental, while also working on our own communication strategy. We do so much in the region. We have historically. We don't toot our own horn enough, right? Often. There are obviously, you know, ways to do this that are some are more effective than others, depends on the context, depends on the country. But we need to think very critically about the types of projects we're pursuing through development assistance, right? And how best to amplify the gains and communicate the value of those, both here, domestically to justify their continuation, but also overseas.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair. He always says, you have nothing to yield back, Kaine. You've gone way over your time. He said that to me yesterday.